I'm going to be talking to you about the key bits of context that we need to know for Animal Farm. Animal Farm, probably more than any of the other texts that we study, the context is enormous. So I've tried to be selective, and these are sort of the key things that we need to know. But you may find that you want to supplement it with more specific little details here and there. But these are sort of the big picture things that I would want you to know. I'm going to look at how it should be incorporated into the essays that you write, what motivated Orwell to write Animal Farm, the ideas behind the allegory, communism, and then each of the key characters and their allegories. Okay, so just as a reminder, here are our literature assessment objectives. So AO1, answering the question, showing your understanding of the text and using quotes and references. AO2, which is about the analysis of language using subject terms. And then here is AO3, so understanding what was happening in the real world and how and why this influenced the writer of the text. Note that it's 6 marks, so much fewer marks, half marks compared to AO1 or AO2. And so this isn't a history essay. We are looking for evidence of where we can see that historical influence on Orwell rather than just recounting everything that we know about the Russian Revolution. Key things to be aware of when you're writing about context, and this sort of applies to any of the texts that we study, not just Animal Farm. Things that we like are a minimum of 3 links to context throughout the whole essay. 1 isn't enough, 2 isn't enough. You do want a couple of references that you decide where they best fit. So think carefully about where you put them in. Try and make sure that you've explained how that contextual point links to what it is that you've said. So almost a comment on why you've decided to include that bit of context at this point. What we don't like is this random shoehorning in of context. It is not helpful to just be listing some things that you know about the Russian Revolution if it doesn't answer the question. We're always trying to think, right, what context do I know that is worth me including here to further my mark, to further show my understanding of why Orwell has written this book and what he's trying to comment on or criticise in the real world. Very much a big no. Don't just write a paragraph. Lots of schools got into the habit of getting kids to just write a paragraph at the beginning of their essay that said 4 or 5 context points, and AQA don't like that, and they will now never award that above 1 mark. You could say the cleverest stuff in the world, but they're only going to give you 1 mark for it. It is 100% about answering the question, knowing which context to use to talk about whatever your particular theme or character that you're talking about. So a couple of things about what inspired Orwell. So it started off with him seeing a young boy and a cart horse, and he noticed that this tiny child could control this huge horse, and he said that it struck me that if only animals became aware of their strength, we'd have no power over them, and that made him think about the way rich people exploit the proletariat, the working class people at the time, and that sort of seeing those two and thinking about rich people and how they manipulate people that that work for them, that sort of started that thought process of Animal Farm. He also has said that it is Animal Farm is a satire, it is a sort of a bit of a joke version of the Russian Revolution, but he also means for it to have a wider meaning. So it's about how leaders are flawed. I think he believes that all leaders are flawed, and that the best thing to do is to make a change and then get rid of the leaders, and that it's leaders that are the issue. And so talking about leaders in general is also relevant context. He mentions and he says the key moment, he thinks the most important moment in the book is where the pigs keep the milk at the end of chapter 2, and that if the animals had stood up for themselves then, that Manor Farm, or Animal Farm as it became, would have been a good place. That the flaw is allowing the leaders to become corrupt. So yeah, just so we're super clear, it is about the Russian Revolution, and we do want you to know key things about the Russian Revolution, but it's also just about leaders and government and power and corruption and almost using animals to show what humans are like, which is a sort of interesting idea. So any comments on leadership or power and the belief that, you know, power corrupts you, would also get you AO3 marks, as long as you are able to link it to the focus of the question. Okay, so before we look at some of the specific allegories, it seems like a good place to think about what an allegory is. This is a word that I would like you to be using in any essay about Animal Farm. So an allegory is where characters and events mirror events in the real world. And Animal Farm is an allegory of the Russian Revolution. It focuses on the removal of the Tsar from power in Russia, and then he's replaced by a revolutionary group called the Bolsheviks, who introduced the idea of communism into Russia. That's what the story of Animal Farm is an allegory for. So before we look at any specific characters, just as a quick recap, what communism is. So it's a political system, but it's also an economic system. So it's about the way money is shared in countries. And under a communist leader, individuals don't own anything. They don't own land or factories or machinery or property or anything. It is owned by the community, and everybody shares the things that they create. So the more successful the country is, the better that is for each of the individuals, and everybody is given what they need, and it's more evenly distributed across the country, or the individuals in the country. Right, so this would be a point to pause. You've got this sheet in your booklet, so you're just having a look. On the left hand side are some of the characters, and then on the right hand side are their allegorical counterparts, and that just means the person that they're an allegory of, and it would be worth seeing if you can match them up without having to listen to me go through them. How many of them can you remember? So pause the video now and do that. Okay, I'm going to go through the allegorical counterparts now. So we're starting off with Farmer Jones. Farmer Jones represents the Tsar Nicholas II, and he is the ruler of Russia at the time. His family have been in power for hundreds of years, and he is the leader that is removed and replaced by the Bolsheviks. He was a very flawed man, a man who lived in real luxury while most of the people in Russia were starving and freezing. He made some mistakes around war. He had an unpopular German wife. He had some sort of flawed advisors. They were telling him that everybody liked him and everybody was happy, and that clearly wasn't the case. And all of those factors sort of led to him being overthrown by the Bolsheviks. And that's Farmer Jones. He's a flawed leader. He drinks heavily. He's not doing his job as a farmer effectively. The animals go hungry, and that's what leads to the rebellion on Animal Farm. Old Major represents a couple of people. So he represents Lenin, who was the original leader of the Bolsheviks. He was the one who led the group to overthrow the government and was the leader of the government when they got rid of the Tsar. He also represents Karl Marx, who was a philosopher, and he wrote a book called The Communist Manifesto, which talks about how it was a sort of an inevitability that the working class would choose to, or would recognise their power and rise up and overthrow the richer people that were keeping them poor. And he represents kind of the idealistic views of Karl Marx, that theory, but also the practice, because Old Major's speech is the catalyst for starting animalism on the farm. So he represents those two people. Obviously, Old Major is incredibly intelligent and articulate, which is possibly a problem ultimately, that the animals don't fully understand what what they're being told. But it's his dream in chapter 1 that starts the rebellion. King Napoleon is the allegorical counterpart of Joseph Stalin. He's a tyrannical dictator. He rules Russia after Vladimir Lenin's death, and he is cruel and violent. He's in charge for a long period of time, over 30 years. He's becomes quite violent, becomes quite paranoid, and we definitely see those qualities in Napoleon in the book as well. We've also got Snowball, the white pig, and he represents Leon Trotsky. And Trotsky was Lenin's right-hand man. When Lenin was dying, he made it clear that he wanted Trotsky to be in power. Stalin managed to overrule that. Snowball's a very good public speaker, and that is the same as Trotsky, who was an excellent public speaker. He was a military lead, and we see that military skill that Snowball has when he arranges the Battle of the Cowshed. We see that real skill, that he's got that real intelligence. A lot of parallels between Snowball and Old Major to emphasise Lenin's like of Trotsky, wanting him to rule after he died. Unfortunately, he is exiled from Russia and subsequently murdered, although that doesn't happen to Snowball. Snowball just disappears in chapter 4. Okay, one of the other key pigs is the character of Squealer. He represents propaganda, those ideas of spreading things that aren't true. And he specifically represents a newspaper called the Pravda. So Stalin was the editor of it, and he used this newspaper to rewrite history. He would emphasise his role in the original Russian Revolution, which wasn't true. And he also used it to spread his ideologies, ideas, some lies about how successful Russia was at the time. And that's exactly what Squealer's doing in the book. He's sent out to convince the animals that everything's okay. He's a really clever speaker, and that manages to sort of trick them the vast majority of the time. Then we've got Boxer. So Boxer represents the male proletariat at the time, the working class people. I think it's worth noting, Orwell tells us that Boxer is initially the equivalent of 2 horses, and then under animalism, more like 3 horses. There's almost a respect for the physical strength of the Russian working class man. Orwell thinks that they're maybe better than other working class males elsewhere in the world, but obviously the lack of education is a thing that limits their ability to understand what is happening. Boxer's naivety is his flaw. He's too trusting in the things that he's told. There are some ways in which he spots things. He spots, but he never is confident in challenging the pigs. Some people also argue that he represents Alexei Stakhanov, who was a Russian miner who broke the record for how much coal could be mined in a specific amount of time, and he was celebrated on the front cover of Time newspaper, but he was really disliked because he put so much pressure on the other workers to work even harder. Like, they're working really hard, but Alexei Stakhanov could do more. And so there's that pressure in the same way that we see Boxer take on more and more work and get up earlier and work later, and we see that evidence of him being pushed to do more and more and more. Molly, my favourite. So Molly, the white horse, she represents the petty bourgeoisie, and these were lower middle class people, most of whom left Russia after the rebellion. They are people who often worked in trade and sale of goods. They had goods and property, and that's really why she's so materialistic, and she wants her ribbons, and she wants the sugar, she wants the rewards. She represents those people who are doing all right in Russia under the Tsar. If you're doing okay under the Tsar, this system where we introduce communism and redistribute our goods, you're going to get less. And so most of the petty bourgeoisie chose to leave Russia. Some stayed, and I think there were around 70,000 members of this group that ended up in labour camps. So it didn't go brilliantly well for this group of people, and Molly's decision to leave is probably a good one. Her nose is stroked by the publican. She's being fed sugar. She's happy. So she goes to a capitalist system and benefits under that. And we've got Moses. So this was Farmer Jones's pet. He's a pet raven, and this emphasises the connection between the people in power and the church and how they can use one another to maintain their power. So Moses represents the church in Russia. So under Farmer Jones, he was supported and fed food and looked after by Farmer Jones, and then he disappears for some period of time, and then a little while later he returns and continues to talk about Sugar Candy Mountain and what the animals could get after death. This is a thing that Orwell strongly believed was a way that leaders manipulated predominantly working class people by telling them that if you do everything that you can do in this life, if you work yourself to the bone, in the future you can go to heaven. And that means that you will tolerate a much worse existence now under the belief that you'll have a forever existence in somewhere that's better. If you are an atheist, you're less willing to accept having an awful life because you believe that's just your life. So Marx saw it as a drug, the opiate of the people, a drug that people are addicted to, and they want more and more, but actually just leaders are using it to manipulate people to do whatever it is that they want to do.